1723. The Atlantic Ocean is no longer ruled by kings or empires, but by monsters with black flags. Their names spread terror from Boston taverns to the Caribbean seas, and among them, one stood out for his cruelty: Edward Lowe. This is not just a story of pirates. It is a story of betrayal, blood, and a shadow that haunted the ocean long after the ropes went tight. The year was 1723, a time when the Atlantic Ocean was no safe passage for any merchant. The sea belonged not to kings or empires, but to men who lived outside Olo Spirit. The name that spread terror along the New England coast was Edward Lowe, a man whose cruelty was whispered about in every tavern from Boston to the Caribbean. He had begun, as many did, a poor Londoner, once a common thief who had crossed the ocean searching for fortune. But fortune never smiled upon him in the honest trade. Instead, he discovered power through fear, and fear was the only coin he trusted. Lowe commanded his ship, the Fancy, with iron discipline and a temper so violent that even hardened sailors trembled in his presence. By his side sailed Charles Harris, a younger captain entrusted with command of the smaller vessel Ranger. Harris was not as savage as his master, yet he had chosen his path. He followed Lowe's black flag, and by that choice, he sealed his fate. The coast of New England lived in dread. Fishermen told stories of ships stripped bare, their crews left adrift to die. There were darker tales, men mutilated, captains forced to watch their crew tortured. The most ghastly rumor claimed that Edward Lowe once cut off a prisoner's lips and roasted them before his eyes. Whether true or not, the stories served their purpose. No sailor dared resist when Lowe's sails appeared on the horizon. In Boston taverns, whispers grew into fear. Merchants begged the Royal Navy for protection. It was then that Captain Peter Solgaard of His Majesty's ship Greyhound received his orders. His mission: hunt down Lowe and his band before they strangled the trade of the colonies. Solgaard was a disciplined officer, proud of his ship and crew. He knew the task was perilous. Pirates fought like cornered wolves, and the Atlantic was vast. Yet Solgaard believed in the Crown's justice. The summer of 1723 was heavy with heat. On the wide Atlantic, winds fell quiet at times, leaving the ships adrift on a sea of glass. At night, the heavens burned with stars so bright that sailors swore they saw omens in the constellations, nooses, and crowns. On the deck of the Ranger, Charles Harris stared into the night. He was young, not much older than many of his men, yet the weight of command pressed upon him. He had seen Lowe's cruelty, and though part of him recoiled, another part hardened. To survive among wolves, one had to learn to bite. His men looked at him with a mixture of loyalty and fear, for they knew that hesitation in battle meant death far to the west. Greyhound patrolled, her sails stretched against the summer winds. Captain Solgaard kept his men drilled and ready. Rumors of Lowe's position reached him through captured merchants, each tale more dreadful than the last. He knew that to meet Lowe in open battle would test not only his ship, but the courage of every soul aboard. And so, the stage was set. In the waters near Block Island, fate began to draw two worlds together: the ruthless law of pirates and the stern justice of the Crown. Dawn rolled in like a pale bruise along the horizon. The Ranger rose and fell on long, patient swells, her rigging whispering, her hull answering with tired creaks. Charles Harris stood by the quarterdeck rail and watched the water slip past. A ribbon of pewter, a gull wheeled once, twice, and vanished toward the low smear of land that would later be named by the lookout Block Island. No more than a thumbprint on the sea. Harris had slept little. The night watch had brought ugly business. A captured coaster out of Newport, her hold stacked with flour and salt pork. Her crew, 8 men and a boy, lashed to the mainmast, while Lowe's boarding party tore the vessel like a carcass. Harris had been there, ordering the stores transferred, calculating tonnage against speed, deciding which barrels to keep and which to roll, thumping into the dark. He tried not to look at the boy, who stared at him with the naked accusation only the young can hold. Lowe arrived later in the night on the Fancy, his face a hard mask inside the lantern's circle. He walked the deck of the captured coaster with a butcher's impatience, asking quick, clipped questions about cargo and routes. One of the merchant sailors spat and called him a devil. Lowe's glance flicked. A pistol barked. The man folded without a sound. When Harris looked again, Lowe was already issuing new orders. There was no ceremony to it, no speech, no theatrics, only the same cold arithmetic that Harris himself practiced. Stripped of shame. "Captain," said Ben Tully, Harris's gunner, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Wind steady. Northeast. If we keep to the shoals, we'll make the island by noon." Harris nodded. "Keep the men at quarters. Anyway, I don't like open water this close to Rhode Island. Makes the Navy nervous." Tully grinned with half his mouth. Navy's always nervous when they smell us. On the Greyhound, Captain Peter Solgaard considered a different arithmetic. He had spent the early dawn with his sailing master over a chart scarred with grease and thumbprints, plotting reports like constellations. A brig taken on Tuesday, a schooner robbed of pitch, tar, and canvas Wednesday. A whisper that Lau had been seen in company with a smaller sloop, Ranger moving light and quick between Block Island and the mainland. Solgaard's fingers traced wind, roses, and tidal arrows. Lowe was drawing near to the trade routes like a shark nosing into a harbor mouth. "Mr. N," Solgaard said to his first lieutenant, "double-shot the long fours and keep the men sober. I want exercise of the guns before breakfast." "Aye," Sir Ansis hesitated. "Permission to speak freely," said with the stiff courtesy of a man who had already decided to speak. Solgaard inclined his head. "The men have heard stories," Asti said. "About Lowe? Then give them better ones," Solgaard answered. "Tell them we'll catch him and hang him. Tell them I've seen worse men than Lowe, and they all danced in the end." Anstice's mouth twitched almost a smile. "Aye, sir." They beat 2 quarters, and the deck thudded with disciplined hurry. Powder monkeys sprinted with leather buckets. Swivel guns squealed into position like excited dogs. The long guns yawned their dark mouths toward the open sea. Solgaard walked to the line, pausing to correct a stance, to adjust a match, to murmur praise. He was not a man of speeches either, but he understood that confidence can be built like a wall, brick by brick, order by order. Mid-morning Block Island rose from the water, a low-backed animal crouched under a blanket of summer haze. To fishermen, it was a refuge. To pirates, an ambush. Channel currents twisted there like coiled ropes, and fog could arrive as fast as a lie. Harris trimmed the Ranger's sails for speed, feeling the shiver run through the canvas like a held breath. Signal from the Fancy, the lookout called. "To Flagskeep Station." Harris lifted his glass. Lowe's ship rode ahead, the black flag furled for now, her hull scarred from a dozen fights, yet lean, beautiful in a predatory way. He felt the old pull of admiration, the recognition of skill where it appears no matter what colors it flies. Lowe knew how to use water and wind like tools, knew how to read a man in a heartbeat. He was a monster, yes, but he was not a fool. A pair of boats bobbed far off the port beam, most likely, their sails patched and bodies bent like question marks over their decks. One of them lifted his head, squinted toward the pirates, and dropped his gaze fast again, as if refusing to offer his eyes to the devil. "Let them pass," Harris said. "We're not fishing today." The crew relaxed by a hair. On a pirate ship, mercy feels like a borrowed coat. Warm for a moment, never truly yours. By noon, the sun burned away the haze and turned the water to hammered silver. A line of smoke smudged the horizon of storm. Harris knew. Galley. Smoke. Warship. Smoke. His stomach tightened. "Glass, eh? Is not it?" The lens bit his brow. Slowly, the smudge resolved into a triangle of sails, then into the shape of a ship running clean and neat, yards squared, no wasted motion. Royal Navy. The reality of it was colder than rumor. Tully stood at his elbow. "That'll be our dancing partner, then." "Keep your wit for the guns," Harris said, but not unkindly. He ordered the Ranger to run a point off the fancy's starboard quarter. As Lowe would expect, a good wolf runs in formation. Flags cracked in the bright air orders from Lowe. Bear south a fraction. Test the stranger's stomach. Harris obeyed. The Ranger dipped and surged, her bow throwing small pearls of spray. Behind him, he could feel the crew recalculating their lives. The men who gripped lucky pieces, the men who muttered prayers they pretended not to know, the men who stared openly at the warship with the fatal hunger that lives in gamblers and soldiers. On the Greyhound, Solgaard felt a different hunger. At last, a shape on the water that matched the shape in his mind. Two ships, a larger and a smaller, running in company, testing the edges of the shoals. He lifted his hat to shade his eyes and judged distances like a carpenter measuring planks. Helm, 2 points to starboard. Keep them. Thinking we're slower than we are, he said. Mr. Anstice, have the drummer save his arms. There will be time enough to pound him bloody. Anstice laughed outright. The crew grinned, tension released like steam. Gun crews leaned into their work with renewed attention, wiping metal, checking, elevating screws, cutting fuses. The ship smelled of tar, salt, and something bright and dangerous eagerness. Afternoon stretched its glare over the water. Lowe altered course a hair's breadth, and the Fancy seemed to become a shadow of herself, harder to judge, harder to follow. Harris mimicked the shift. The Greyhound answered with a clean turn that wasted no wind. A first exchange of courtesies, the simplest kind, conducted at a mile's distance and across a century of practice. Are you ready? Yes, we are. Harris felt the Ranger hum like a plucked string. He thought, unbidden, of the boy on the coaster. The boy had a scar on his chin shaped like a crescent moon. He wondered if the boy could swim. He wondered why. He wondered now. Captain, Tully said softly. Orders. Run as Lowe runs, Harris said. And when the time comes, stand. The words cost him nothing and everything. Toward late afternoon, the wind freshened, and with it, resolve. Solgaard looked from the enemy to his men, faces salt-burned and sun-browned, eyes squinting, mouths set. He felt a pride that tasted almost like pity. He would lead them into smoke and iron and ask them to die with style. B2 quarters. Aside at last, the drum began. A flat rattle that cut the day into pieces. On the pirate ships, heads turned. On the Greyhound, powdered doors swung open, voices sharpened. All the waiting that had filled the long hours of light drained away, leaving only action. The first fleck of spray from a testing shot appeared between them, brave, insignificant. Then the echo rolled out like thunder asked to dress as a gentleman. Even the gulls held their tongues. The sound of the drum still echoed across the water when the first real shot roared from the Greyhound. A long iron bowl, doubled, screamed over the waves and plunged just short of the Fancy's bow, throwing up a fountain of spray. It was not meant to strike, but to announce. The crown had come to collect. On the deck of the Ranger, Charles Harris braced himself as his men scrambled to their stations. Powder horns clattered, matches hissed, and the smell of brimstone joined the salt air. He could feel their fear as a pulse beneath his feet. These men were not fools. They knew the difference between robbing helpless coasters and facing the King's Navy. But fear could sharpen as well as blunt. Steady, Harris coiled. We are not the first to face the lion's teeth, and we won't be the last. Hold fast, lads. Another shot thundered, closer this time. Splinters flying from the Fancy's stern rail. Lowe, at his quarterdeck, did not flinch, his dark eyes fixed on the enemy. He barked orders with the cold certainty of a man who trusted violence more than wind or tide. His sails shifted, his guns ran out. He meant not to flee, but to test. The sea between Block Island and the mainland boiled with sudden purpose. Greyhound bore down with disciplined precision, her sails trimmed fine, her gunners waiting for the order that would turn the world into smoke. The pirates answered with ragged defiance. their flags snapping, their guns booming unevenly, but with savage intent. Harris's Ranger shuddered under the recoil of her first broadside. The blast deafened, the deck lurched, and the air filled with choking powder smoke. Through it, he glimpsed the cannonballs skipping across the waves, one striking the Navy ship's forechains, showering her deck with sparks. A cheer went up from his men, wild and desperate. Harris let it live a moment, then shouted, "Reload! Faster! They'll give us back double." And double it was. The Greyhound answered with a broadside that tore into the Ranger's starboard flank. The crack of splintering oak, the scream of iron through flesh. The howl of men struck down, it came all at once. Harris staggered, caught himself on the rail, and saw blood painting the deck beneath his gunner Tully. Tully still stood, face pale, one arm hanging useless. But he grinned. "Just a scratch, Captain." The gun cells sing again. Low, seeing the Ranger stagger, signaled for her to hold the line. His fancy willed, loosed her own broadside, and for a moment the sky itself seemed to collapse into smoke and flame. Solgard on the Greyhound stood firm, his orders clear and precise. His men moving with the rhythm of training honed by years. For every ragged pirate volley, he gave a measured answer. The battle became a storm. Smoke thickened until men could barely see the length of their deck. The cries of the wounded rose, mingled with the steady roar of guns. Cannonballs punched through timbers like fists through cloth, showering the lower decks with splinters sharp as daggers. Buckets of water sloshed, blood ran in the scuppers, and still the guns fired. Harris fought to keep his ship alive. Patch that sail. Drag the wounded clear. Keep the larboard guns hot. He shouted until his throat burned. The men obeyed because the alternative was despair. For an instant the smoke cleared, and Harris saw the Greyhound cutting between him and the Fancy. Low's larger ship turned sharply, sails straining, and slipped into the mist, running southward. The meaning struck Harris like a blow. Low was leaving him. The Ranger was smaller, slower, already battered. Solgard had chosen his prey, and the Crown's teeth closed around it. "Captain," Tully rasped, clutching his bleeding arm. "Orders." Harris hesitated. He thought of surrender, of survival, of the boy with the crescent scar. He thought of Low's eyes, cold and merciless. To yield meant disgrace, perhaps a short rope in Newport. To fight meant death-buttered death with his men beside him, not as a gift to Low's cruelty. "Stand," Harris said hoarsely. "Stand and give them everything." The Ranger turned, her guns answering with furious defiance. Cannonballs ripped into the Greyhound's rigging, tearing lines and canvas. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible, as though raw rage could match discipline. But Solgard pressed forward, unshaken, his gunners pounding with mechanical precision. The Ranger's deck ran slick, her masts groaned, her hull bled water. At last a broadside from the Greyhound struck true, smashing the Ranger's main. It toppled with a scream of wood, crashing across the deck and pinning men beneath its weight. The ship lurched, her guns falling silent one by one. Smoke drifted away, revealing her broken form, her crew staggering in defeat. "Strike your colors!" Solgard's voice rang across the water, carried by trumpet. "Strike, or be sent to the bottom." Harris stared at the black flag, torn and hanging from the shattered mast. His men looked at him with hollow eyes, waiting. He felt the weight of command more cruelly than ever before. At last, he gave a nod. Slowly, reluctantly, the black flag was lowered. A cheer rose from the Greyhound, sharp and triumphant. The Ranger had been taken. Harris and his surviving crew were prisoners of the Crown. As the Navy boarded, binding the wounded and dragging the defiant, Harris raised his eyes once more to the horizon. Far to the south, just a shadow now, the Fancy slipped away into the haze. Edward Lowe had abandoned him. The monster lived on, while Harris and his men would march toward judgment. The Atlantic was quiet again, save for the groans of the wounded and the slap of waves against blood-stained hulls. The clash was over. The reckoning had begun. The The voyage to Newport was not long, but for the captured men of the Ranger, it felt like a slow march to the gallows. Shackled in the dim hold of the Greyhound, they sat in silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the rasp of chains against wood. The air stank of tar, blood, and fear. Charles Harris sat apart, his back against the bulkhead. Wrists bound before him. His eyes were open, but he seemed to look through the planks, as though searching for some crack in time itself where fate might have turned differently. He remembered the thunder of guns, the crash of his mast, the moment the BlackFlag fell. He remembered, too, the sight of the Fancy dwindling into the haze, Low's sails disappearing with no backward glance. Some of his men cursed Low aloud, calling him coward, traitor, devil. Others clung to a bitter hope. Perhaps the Navy would show mercy. Harris said nothing. He knew enough of history to understand what awaited pirates in the colonies. When at last, Newport's harbor opened before them, the prisoners were hauled up from below. Bright sunlight stabbed their eyes. The town's roofs and church spires gleamed against the summer sky, but no welcome waited there. Crowds had already gathered along the wharves, spilling into streets, pressing forward to glimpse the pirates. Mothers pulled children close. Merchants shouted curses. Fishermen spat into the water. The news of Low's terror had spread far and fast. Now here were his companions, shackled and broken, to serve as an answer. The march through town was a gauntlet of hatred. Soldiers pushed the prisoners forward with pikes, while townsfolk jeered, hurled stones, and shouted for justice. One man threw a noose, landing it around a pirate's neck, pulling until soldiers drove him back. Harris kept his head high, though every step was a weight dragging him deeper into doom. They were confined in the jail, a cold stone building that smelled of mildew and despair. There they waited until the trial convened, hearing the mutter of guards and the distant church bells tolling. The trial began in the courthouse, a wooden hall crowded to suffocation. Judges in wigs presided, their faces stern as stone. Clerks scribbled notes, while the jury, drawn from townsmen, sat with hard eyes fixed on the accused. The charges were read aloud: piracy, robbery, murder upon the high seas, crimes against His Majesty's peace. Witnesses were brought forth, merchant captains who told of their ships boarded, crews stripped, cargoes stolen. Some spoke of mutilations, of threats more terrible than death. One fisherman, trembling, recounted how Low's men had seized his brother and left him adrift without food or water. Though Edward Low himself had escaped, his shadow loomed over every word, and for Harris and the rest, it mattered little. Guilt by association was guilt enough. When Harris was called to speak, arose, slowly chains, clinking. His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed the strain within. I commanded the Ranger. But I did not choose the path of cruelty. I followed Low, because to refuse was to die. My men, he gestured toward the prisoners beside him, are not deadly. They are sailors who lost their way, lured by promises of gold. If mercy exists under this crown, let it fall upon those who still have years to live. There was a murmur in the hall, but the judges did not soften. The law of piracy was clear, and the colonies had suffered too long. The jury retired only briefly, before returning with a verdict: guilty. On all counts, the sentence was death by hanging. A gasp ran through the room, though no one was surprised. Some of the pirates cried out, swearing, weeping, cursing the court. Others fell silent, staring at nothing. Harris closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, calm now, as if the weight of waiting had been lifted. In the days that followed, the prisoners were held under guard, visited by ministers who urged them to repent. Some confessed tearfully, begging God for mercy. Others laughed bitterly, spitting scripture back at the preachers. Harris listened more than he spoke, his mind wandering to the sea, to the life he had chosen and the one he had thrown away. Outside, Newport buzzed with anticipation. The execution would be public, a spectacle to remind all who watched that the Crown's justice was inexorable. Men repaired the gallows, Carpenters hammering under the hot sun. Taverns filled with talk of the hanging. Wagers laid on how many would go calmly, how many would scream. Parents warned children. This is the price of sin. For the prisoners, time shrank. Each night, the bells tolled. Each morning, the sun rose, and each step brought them closer to the scaffold. And still, across the water, Edward Lowe remained free. The morning of the execution dawned clear and merciless. The bells of Newport tolled, calling not to prayer, but to spectacle. Long before the hour, crowds gathered along the streets and in the open square where the gallows had been raised. Farmers, merchants, sailors, women with babes in arms all, pressed close, their faces lit with grim expectation. Children perched on shoulders, eager to see death as if it were a play. From the jail, the condemned were led in chains, guarded by soldiers with fixed bayonets. Their steps rang hollow on the cobblestones, echoing between the houses. Some walked with heads bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. Others cursed aloud, spitting defiance at the mob. Harris walked in silence, shoulders squared, his eyes steady on the gallows that rose like a scaffold to the sky. Astay, passed townsfolk shouted, "Murderers, devils! Hang them high!" Some hurled rotten fruit, striking faces and chests. A woman shrieked the name of her husband, lost to pirates, and spat full into a prisoner's eyes. The guards did not intervene. This was part of justice too. The gallows stood stark against the morning sun, beams freshly hewn, ropes swinging gently in the breeze. 30 nooses waited, each one a promise. The prisoners were arranged beneath them, the crowd pressing forward, murmurs rising and falling like the sea. A minister stepped forward, Biblia in hand, voice raised to the heavens. He spoke of sin and salvation, of the Lord's mercy to the penitent. Some prisoners sobbed openly, clutching at the words as drowning men clutch at wreckage. Others laughed, muttering that the devil had been their only master. Harris stood unmoved, listening with a distant gaze, as if the sermon were meant for another world. When his turn came to speak, Harris raised his voice so all might hear. "I will not plead for mercy, for it is too late. I will not curse my fate, for I chose my path. But I say this, remember that not all who follow a black flag do so out of cruelty. Some are driven by hunger, by desperation, by chains of another kind. I pray the sea forgives me, if men will not." A hush fell over the crowd, brief but heavy. Then the marshal gave the signal. One by one, the nooses were placed around the prisoners' necks. The ropes creaked, the knots tightened. The crowd leaned forward, breath held. Harris closed his eyes, drawing one last breath of salt air carried from the harbor. He thought of the boy with the crescent scar, of the sea rolling endless and free, of the sails of the Fancy vanishing into the haze. The trapdoors fell. 13 bodies dropped, ropes snapping taut. Some at reach head, some hung still. Some gave a final gasp before silence claimed them. The crowd erupted some, cheering, some crossing themselves, some turning away pale and shaken. Children clapped as if the play had ended. The bodies swung in the morning light, stark reminders of the price of piracy. 4 hours they hung, until the sun climbed high, and the stench of death drifted over the square. At last they were cut down and buried in shallow graves outside the town, marked only by the memory of those who had watched. Yet across the sea, the story did not end. Edward Lowe, the architect of terror, had slipped away on the Fancy. His sails carried him beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of Solgard's justice. Some said he sailed south to the Caribbean, others that he vanished into the wild Atlantic. Rumors of his cruelty would continue, whispers in taverns and prayers in churches, each darker than the last. The gallows had claimed to Harris and his men, but the shadow of Lowe remained. Newport had seen justice done, yet the sea was not cleansed. The Atlantic still belonged, for a time, to the Black Flag. And so the tale closed not with triumph, but with unease. For every rope that swung in the summer breeze, another sail appeared on the horizon, and another story of terror began.